Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar. This is one of our regular webinars that we do on Tuesday evening where we discuss a particular issue and invite a speaker to talk through with us that issue. We cover a wide range of topics in GlobalNet 21, and I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21, by the way. We cover a wide range of issues and have a great variety of really good speakers talking about those issues, which you can engage with through conversation and through questions. Well, today we're dealing with one topic that we've dealt with before, and that's human trafficking. But we're going to look at child trafficking particularly, because that's been on the rise increasingly in the UK, and the UK is a centre in many ways for child trafficking, and the referrals in this country have gone up quite dramatically over the last couple of years. And so people are talking about the term slaves on our streets, often children who are trafficked, often in terms of labour exploitation in the cannabis industry and elsewhere. And it's a really, really big problem, and a number of organisations trying to do something about it. We've got Parisha on here, I know, who did a webinar with us about this some time ago, and I know she's trying to raise awareness about it. Now, Marissa's been doing this for a long time. She is a trainer. She does a lot of really good work. She's a qualified social worker. She's going to introduce herself and her colleague Nigel, and then we'll start. But before we do, let me say this webinar will be recorded, and it should be up on YouTube, I hope, tomorrow, and you can watch it again or disseminate it to others. So I'm going to say over to you, Marissa, now, and thank you for doing this. And we're ready now to hear your presentation.
Thank you. My name is Marissa De Jager. I am, like Francis said, a qualified social worker. I have experience within practice as a manager, and also I have senior management experience. My passion is children and protecting children and any type of harm that comes to them. I just want to make sure that children and young people are heard, that we know what they need to do, and actually that we are identifying concerns like trafficking or modern slavery at an early stage. We work nationally. Our company is called Shared Vision, and Nigel is one of our partners with me within the company. You can introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm going to be in the beginning and I'm going to disappear. And in case there are any questions that I can help with, then I'll float back in. So big apologies, but I can't stay for the whole webinar. And I'm not as knowledgeable as Marissa on this. My name's Nigel Bolton. I served for 31 amazing years as a police officer, senior detective for most of that. And I work with Marissa as a partner in Shared Vision, dealing with safeguarding issues, of which obviously trafficking in all its descriptions is part of our day-to-day work. One of the things I know Marissa is going to touch on, which is very close to my professional heart, is that of trafficking within the gangs and the county line work across the UK and actually across the world. So that's a little bit about me. It's over to Marissa, and if I have to pop in, it means you've asked a question and Marissa would rather I answer.
Yeah.
Have a great webinar.
Absolutely. I'm going to share our PowerPoints now. Today I want to talk about, or tonight, about human trafficking and modern day slavery, and specifically how we protect children and young people. Now, trafficking in itself, as well as modern slavery, is a complex global crime, I would say, and it requires both international and local action. Due to its hidden nature, it makes the identification of victims difficult, and it's also difficult to grasp the problem and develop effective responses. So long-term prevention in relation to these matters requires that we address global socio-economic inequality, I would say. We need to improve public and professional understanding and awareness. And I think we need to almost make trafficking and modern slavery a non-profitable business. And with that, we will reduce demand for trafficking and also enslavement of children. Trafficking and modern slavery is child abuse, and it requires child protection responses. So it's a crime, and I think it's an abuse of human rights. We have all sorts of legislation and policy and guidance these days within England or in the UK. In particular, within England, we have the Children Act 1989 and the Children Act 2004 that support us as professionals to actually deal with the matters. We also, in terms of the policy that we have within England, in particular in the country, we have the national referral mechanism that was brought in by the government as an initiative in 2009. Now, some would say that it's working really, really well, and others would say actually it's not really working that well because we're not really there yet, I think, from my opinion, in identifying victims early enough. The guidance within London in particular, which is where I practice, we obviously have lots of procedures locally where and how we deal with trafficking and modern slavery. But I know nationally there's guidance of all sorts. So going to my presentation, I've already introduced myself. I want to look at child trafficking in a bit more detail. So child trafficking in itself is the recruitment or harboring or transportation of children, but it's specifically for exploitation, and it's the act and the purpose that makes it a crime. Now, the United Nations Palermo Protocol, which is about prevention and suppression of any type of trafficking, actually have been signed up by the UK and in many other countries. Now, the Palermo Protocol actually identifies a child under the age of 18, and I think that's really, really important. The UK have gone one step further, where they've said actually that trafficking is a form of modern slavery. Now, human trafficking, if you will look a bit more wider away from child trafficking, is the same type of thing in terms of recruitment, harboring, or transporting of people. But it's also into a situation of exploitation through the use of violence or coercion or people being forced to work. So in other words, trafficking is a process of enslaving, coercion them into a situation, and they feel lost and they don't feel like that there's any way out. Now, people can be trafficked in many forms. We've seen so many different forms in terms of human trafficking, in terms of forced prostitution, forced slavery or labour, forced begging, and we've also known about forced organ removal. Now, why do people become victims of human trafficking? Well, I think many people in some situations find themselves a victim of trafficking because of poverty, they want to improve their life, they want to support their families a bit better, and often they get a well-paid job offered to them abroad or in another region, and that leads to already complications because the way they need to travel, the paid job that they need to have, or even accommodation arrangements quite often are paid by the traffickers. And that means when they actually come to another country or when they're in another region, that they're actually trapped into a cycle where they can't pay the traffickers back, and they feel quite lost and actually quite alone. So in the UK in particular, we have a big issue with internal trafficking, and that means children and also others being internally trafficked across or within borders of the UK. And Nigel mentioned earlier in terms of county lines and gang-related activity. I'll touch on that in a moment, but that actually involves exploitation in that way as well as the drug movement that comes with that, and missing children. So looking at a few figures, I've looked at the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, and their figures are quite astonishingly high. We have 51% of identified victims that are trafficked nationally or internationally are women. And then 28% of those are identified as children. Now, if you look at it domestically, in terms of what have been reported so far, 43% of victims have been reported within the UK. Now, that is, or within national borders, and that's quite significant. So the National Crime Agency, NCA, have stated in 2017 that the scale of the crime is quite shocking, and that there are potentially tens of thousands of people actually that's that are reported of as victims that's not known or are known. So the more we look, they said, at modern slavery, the more evidence they actually find in terms of the widespread of abuse. and that the scale is far, far larger than they actually ever thought. Now, the UK, as Francis said also earlier, is the most prominent country of origin for trafficked children. Now, we know from figures that a total of 255 children have been reported so far in terms of trafficking or modern slavery. Just behind us, or at the same time, is Albania of 227 and Vietnam, for example, of 227. Now, speaking of Vietnam, ECPAT in particular have recently done an animated video called The Secret Garden, and it's about a young Vietnamese boy that had been trafficked from Vietnam, where he left his grandparents behind, and he was offered a job, he thought, within the UK, came to the UK and actually was used to work with drugs, and in particular marijuana that was grown and those type of things. Eventually the police came in, they arrested both his friend and him. His friend went to a foster carer, his age was disputed. So I would really recommend that if you go on the web and just search ECPAT and The Secret Garden, it's a really good animation in terms of what trafficking and enslavement actually entails. Now, the close link with county lines violence, exploitation of missing children in particular, or the drug supply, is quite significant with trafficking of children, which are very closely linked with the internal trafficking within the UK. Now, county lines, for those that know or don't know, is obviously the term that's being used to supply drugs from one urban hub or urban hubs to counties. And usually this is associated with urban street gangs. Now, a report recently in 2017 called County Lines Violence, Exploitation and Drug Supply found that 65% of police forces in the UK reported county lines activities linked to exploitation of children, and 42% of forces specifically reported children running or moving drugs down the lines, the drug lines. So the majority of children that have been found to having been exploited for this purpose have been being between the ages of 15 and 17. However, we also know that there's children as young as 12 that have been used to do this drug supply. So what is needed from us as professionals, or the community in particular, or even parents? I think that the findings so far, and if you look back to 2012 in particular, we've only had 12 convictions so far since 2012. The year before that, it was 8. So it's really low in comparison in terms of what we need to do. And I think if we look at this hidden type of abuse or crime, it's quite difficult to identify, and the responses therefore is difficult as well. But I think we need to be a bit more cautious. We need to be having greater concern, in order to protect children, and have that understanding and awareness, like I mentioned before, that we need to have a long-term preventative type of strategy in place. There's an urgent need for effective cross-county police force and local authority intelligence. I think that can be a bit greater. We need to know the hows and the whys a bit more, and actually why are children being recruited to be used for criminal activity, because more and more reporting are coming out in relation to that, and they are exposed to incredible difficulties. So early identification is vital, but early identification for me is quite difficult with this hidden type of crime or abuse. We don't really understand the impact on children that well. Quite often children are really traumatized. I think some professionals will look at it that actually the disclosures by children are quite confusing, it's inconsistent, they don't really remember events as it goes along. And quite often children are not believed when they're in those type of situations. And I think we as professionals need to take those type of circumstances into consideration and make sure that actually, let's record the facts first, let's build that trusted relationship with that child first, and then we decide where we go from there. Because actually, the trauma that they have suffered is so significant and we don't really understand it fully. And then, like I've just said, the impact on children is quite significant. It can be medical impact or educational impact or psychological impact. And I think as professionals, in particular working with children, we need to have a much greater awareness in terms of what the difficulties are. And actually nationally, we need to be a bit more clear in terms of what we need to do and achieve. I think if the national referral mechanism in some opinion is not working well, then we need to have a better way of identifying victims and work much closer with the police, who have to deal with these sort of county lines matters or gang-related matters or exploitation on a much closer level. So from a community or personal or even a professional perspective, I think it's having that understanding and being aware. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions of Nigel.
Okay, thanks very much for doing that, Marissa, and giving us that background. And I'm sure there are quite a lot of things that people will want to ask and to comment on, and we'll put those to you. Remember, everyone, you type your questions and your comments in the chat box on the right-hand corner. Hannah's already put up a question, and Hannah's from my area of the world here in London, and she's asking you, you know, as a social worker, and a background in social work, social workers in general must have one really very difficult job in tracking down children who are trafficked. And many of those children and many of the gangs, many of the people involved, they're quite good at camouflaging or masking that. I mean, how do you actually identify them? How do you go about finding where they are?
Well, I think it's quite a difficult task, as you say, Francis, or even Hannah. I think there's so many different types of cases that a social worker are faced with on a day-to-day basis. We deal with private fostering or you know, unaccompanied minors on a day-to-day basis. You don't really understand their circumstances until you've made a full assessment. And quite often, if I mention private fostering and unaccompanied minors, those children have learned to be a bit more cautious in terms of the information that's forthcoming. So building a relationship with a child on a longer term basis actually is the key, and that direct work that you do in a more creative way with them is critical to any assessment type of work. Now, of course, the Home Office or, you know, other type of professionals, education, health that we work with in multidisciplinary settings like the MASH will have lots and lots of information, and if we can put all the information together, like in the MASH world, then it makes the identification and therefore the response much better. And I think that helps and assists to identify child trafficking.
Hannah also asked, I mean, do you go into schools to chat to children about the dangers, and are the teachers in any way empowered to give them training and to help them in any way?
Well, I think it's a local decision in terms of how things are addressed. Now, some areas, in particular in the UK, are more, I would say, know more and deal more on a day-to-day basis with trafficking. So I suppose if the local decision is that a social worker is required to go and speak within, you know, talk to children and talk to education in relation to matters, then obviously that's there. In my view, I think education plays a really significant part. They see the children on a day-to-day basis. They have that relationship already with the children, so they are that trusted person. So what we do as a company, for example, is we work with a drama group called Chicken Shed. And if you use drama or creative arts in a different way, you also find that children actually step forward. So it's about using creative ways. As social workers, there's many early help type of social workers that now go into the local community and work with the partnership. So yes, absolutely, social workers should form part of that and actually build those relationships with the community around them so that we can better protect children.
Yeah, well, we all know in the part of London I'm from, we all know Chicken Shed because it's in the London Borough of Enfield, and I think Hannah would be very interested in the work you do with Chicken Shed because she works with a site that covers Enfield and gives a lot of news and information. Can I ask you then, Marissa, I mean, why do you think that the UK has become a centre for trafficking? What is so, you know, central about the UK?
I think it's the association of money. It's seen as a centre point for people to come into and travel to and from. You have access to Europe quite quickly. You can be in a few hours, you can be in Afghanistan or wherever. So I just think it's seen as a central hub, to be honest, from my point of view. Why the UK is used in particular, I'm not sure, but that's just my opinion. I think, I don't know, Nigel, if you have an opinion regarding that, but it's, yeah, I think it's about being a central hub.
Yeah, I mean, there must be an infrastructure here that supports that, which is more effective than other countries. And maybe Nigel knows something about that. Is there that infrastructure here that makes the UK attractive in that way?
I think it's the global reach of the UK. I mean, the UK, if you look at it in terms of geography, is quite a small geographic place, but actually in terms of criminality, it's huge. It's connectivity with the Americas, with the USA, with Russia, with the Eastern Bloc, and Africa. It's just that hub that Marissa describes. It was brought home to me, actually. I met Marissa about 5 years ago. Marissa's not, she's a British citizen now, but actually, I think it's pretty obvious, Marissa doesn't originate from the UK. Marissa came to the UK for the very reason that we're talking about. Marissa came because the UK for her, and she's a South African, was the centre of where she wanted to be in the world. She could get to wherever she wanted to be as a young woman in the world from the major airports and ports of the UK. It was a no-brainer. And I know in criminality, and I've done a lot around international corruption, international criminality, international terrorism, the UK is looked upon as that central transport hub for the world. Now, if you are a trafficker of a commodity, whether it's drugs, bullion, or children and adults, then you think in the same way. How can I look at the world and look at a hub? And the UK, and I've got to say now, because we are, as well as you good self, sat in central London doing this webinar for you good people. London is a magnet for transport. And where you have a magnet for transport and the hub for transport activity, you will always see people exploit it for what it is. I think my perspective, I may be wrong, I don't mind, but I have a view that the UK also is a very attractive place, regardless of politics and what's occurring at the moment. It's a very attractive place in terms of finance and the money available, i.e. money that you can tap into for criminal need. And it doesn't take too much to put the two together, that if there's a market and there's the opportunity to access that market through trafficking, through transport, then that's what happens. And I'm afraid that is the reality.
Yeah, Sarah raises a question that, you know, we're living at a time now where there's been a lot of austerity and so on. There are troubled families, problem families, called them troubled families now, who are really suffering because of that. And lots of young people and teenagers are badly affected. They feel depressed. They don't feel, you know, comfortable at home sometimes, and they run away. And that's opened the market up to traffickers, isn't it? And how do we actually, you know, help parents, and how do we let children know that running away could be dangerous?
Gosh, if I could answer that, we could make so much gain in terms of child protection. The major problem here is that society, if we just think about the UK now and children running away in the UK, there is massive amounts of money available in certain sectors of society in the UK today. So therefore, those that are involved in criminality will use those to exploit that. And children who come from parts of society where there is poverty, you know, let's not hide the fact we have outstanding, and I use that in an awful way, levels of poverty in our society, which in its turn is actually still quite a rich society in certain levels of its communities.
I think, the complexity with vulnerability in itself, and also missing being linked to all sorts of things going on in houses, and also trafficking, and you know, like I said, it's a hidden vulnerability. Now that in itself, with the running away of children, makes it quite difficult. So unless we know it and we actually know about the hidden content, it becomes quite difficult to identify.
Well, it is very difficult to identify, and you need to connect the dots. If we look at missing, we need to look wider than why a child is just going missing for 2 days, 3 days, a month. We need to connect up what other reasons that may be behind that. So if we go back to county lines and the use of very young children and teenagers for county lines drug trafficking, one, there are massive amounts of money. If you look at some of the social media feeds that Marissa and I look at daily with our work with people who are involved with gangs, we're not talking about the odd thousand. We are talking about 10s, 20s, 40s, 100,000s of pounds of profit young people, children are making from drug activity, which means the money is there for them and their masters to exploit. So children are involved in horrendous criminality and the money is there to support it. So the missing piece and the connection with gang activity, drugs, violence is really important to put together. It's not just about children being unhappy at home. They are looking for different things and they get involved in different things with different people who influence them. And that's the difficulty with county lines and the trafficking of children. What I would say, I listened to Marissa's presentation from the start, which as ever, and I thought was really interesting from your social work perspective. I hope anyone that sees this presentation of Marissa's and this discussion accept, because there's still a lot of negative viewpoints, that children in the UK who are doing county lines or being trafficked aren't really trafficked because they haven't come from outside the UK. That is utter nonsense. Thank you, Ms. Osby. Utter nonsense. Children are trafficked in this country from one part to the other for criminality and for other reasons.
And children may be trafficked from this country to another country, because we know of many cases of children that have come in, for example, from Afghanistan or even Albania. They found in the UK, we start working with them, and all of a sudden they disappear. And when you trace it back, it might be that they've actually gone back to their own country. So it's not just internal trafficking or trafficking from outside of the UK to the UK. It might be that they come in and they go back again.
Yeah, and if you work in the UK, it's worth reviewing the Home Office, the governmental description now. Please don't put me on the spot with it, but the governmental description of a trafficking is far wider than the majority of professionals, policing, social work, health, education, appreciate. It was widened and it's all encompassing, and it's worth just going back and having a look at the current descriptor, the policy descriptor for a trafficking activity for a child.
Yeah, I also just want on another note in terms of the missing, but not quite missing, I want to touch on. I think private fostering still for me and home education in particular. Although every local authority at this moment in time have a private fostering team and social workers going in and doing assessment, etc., if it's deemed to be a private fostered child, I still think there's many hidden vulnerability around that, and that we need to understand much better in terms of, as professionals. Home education in particular, different matter, but it's just, we don't really know what's going on in houses, and actually the legislation, as we know from media, there's lots of discussions at the moment in terms of what needs to change, etc., for us to get a much clearer grip on that. But I think trafficking, modern slavery, all the other stuff in terms of exploitation, most people these days know about child sexual exploitation, but I think trafficking and modern slavery needs to be on the agenda and should be there alongside all the other stuff that we've just mentioned.
Okay, I mean, do you think that that people don't have an awareness about trafficking in this country, i.e. they think it's another country's problem? They don't think it's so central to this country. And a lot of people might have been shocked about what we said today about London particularly being a central focus. Is there a lack of awareness on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we speak to many people nationally, and I think the awareness can be much greater. They do tend to think it's from outside of the UK into the UK. They don't see it as a national issue as such. Internal trafficking are becoming more of a known type of, let's call it buzzword these days, because of county lines and the gang-related type of problems that's now associated with it, and then therefore children being exploited as a result. But yeah, absolutely. I think we need to pay much greater attention in terms of where we are. And if you look at the figures that I gave earlier in terms of what happens domestically or nationally 43% of children have been reported to be trafficked. Yes, some of them might be from outside, but there are really a great significant amount of numbers that are now being reported inside of this country.
Yeah, I think if you look at the media, in this country we have a very vibrant, I like to still think it's independent media. The majority of media reporting isn't about children from London going out being trafficked. The majority of the media, well, probably rightly, is the big story stuff from abroad into Europe, the immigration discussion. So I think all professionals, just like normal members of the public, which they are, I think can't forget that, they gain their impression of what an issue is from what they see, hear, read, experience from the media. And actually we have an issue which is growing in recognition in this country of our children, our English, UK, British children being trafficked across our country for criminal means. And we need to recognise it, and professions need to recognise it.
Okay, I think you've answered Elijah's question. I don't know if I pronounced your name correctly, but about whether children are trafficked abroad, not British nationals trafficked abroad. You dealt with that really well. Fong, do you want to take up on Helen's second question?
Yes, no, I think it is a common. It is just that it is difficult to find children here in the UK. You have some big Victorian houses with different stores and basements. It is kind of difficult to track them down. However, Parisha, she has a question about the development in the last 3 years. Have we done well in the last 3 years? Had it been increased or decreased in the last 3 years or 5 years?
Well, I think, if you go in terms of the awareness and the understanding of people, certainly, and also if you look at what the NCA have reported to us in 2017, I don't think anyone anticipated that trafficking or internal trafficking or even modern slavery actually will become such a big issue within the UK. So it's only now, if I go back to my point in terms of early identification, the earlier we identify need, harm, and risk issues, but not just as social workers or just as police officers, if we have that cross boundary type or county type of collaboration, then I think it will be a much easier way forward. We need to learn how to identify trafficking much better. We need to understand why it's happening, to our children and young people, and actually why children for as young as 12 years old are being used to do all sorts of things that actually is a crime. I don't know what you want to say.
Well, I'll answer your question slightly differently. I about 20 years ago, when I was a serving senior police officer, we did a thing that we used to talk about, was lifting the stone. And we lifted the stone and we looked underneath it in terms of corruption. And when we looked, we saw what we saw and we had to work with it. Actually, we could never put the stone back again. That's what's happening with trafficking. We've lifted the stone in the last few years that you described, and we're starting to understand what's underneath the stone, and we can't put it back now, which is a great thing. We shouldn't put it back. But actually, we're now having to learn, so to speak, as we go. All the agencies are, and all these agencies, if we think about it, if we think about political context and social context, 2007, economies across the world fell apart. Since then, the amount of resources in the UK going to social work and health and policing have reduced. Now, I'm not one that moans about resourcing, I'm not. But actually, it's during that period of time where resourcing, especially for social work, which is very close to my heart, you may find it strange as an ex-cop, but social work has found more and more and more issues, and this one has come to being in that period of time, and it's really interesting socially. I think that's happened.
And I think technology plays a part as well, because whilst we didn't really know much about stuff going on, or we knew about trafficking, etc. happening, technology these days, social media, all those sort of things play a part, and actually makes it almost an uncontrollable environment for us to work within, and we're trying to catch up all the time. I believe we are getting there. We have lots of strategies and very good strategies out there at the moment. The policies that have been developed with lots of good people out there are actually giving us the guidance that we need to work much more closer to protect children. And whilst there's a low amount of conviction so far, I believe actually the more light we shine on this type of issue, the better we'll become at protecting the children.
I think that was Parisha's point, actually, in a way. She's saying, you know, we become more aware of it, so the authorities have become more aware of it. It's being reported more, so the statistics are going up. What about Hannah's point? I mean, Hannah's point is about the big Victorian houses. It's very often difficult to find people. And in a way that relates to trafficking as domestic servitude. I mean, to what extent do we have children? I mean, we know we have women very often, but to what extent do we have children enslaved in domestic servitude? And they're in these large houses, and it's very difficult to find them up, and no one knows about it.
Well, to be honest, I think most of the information from a social work point of view that comes out in terms of servitude, etc., is through the private fostering route. We know of many cases in terms of that actually have come to light where social workers have gone in, they've started assessing the children, and as we become aware of situations, then we obviously deal with it with the police. So I personally, having managed a private fostering team, know about those type of issues. Again, it's a hidden type of crime or a hidden type of abuse, and unless we are able to either observe it or we have people reporting it to us or we actually become aware of those situations, it makes it quite difficult to deal with. And to be honest, in this country, we go into households with consent as social workers. The only people really being allowed into households without consent, I would say, is the police. So that in itself, if we work as a multidisciplinary team or we actually work together much more closer, actually the identification would be there. So,
can I just put a different answer to that? I mean, you're right. In terms of county lines trafficking of children, mainly out of London to the Shires, drug dealing has changed in the last 5 years, the last decade. Drug dealing used to be done on the street. Children are now being trafficked from, say, East London, North London gangs out of London, and they are being housed in rented accommodation in a different part of the country. So it doesn't matter where, but somewhere, say, within the Thames Valley area or the Hampshire area, a particular town, and children will be trafficked down the railway network, and they will be housed, and they will be put to work dealing drugs within a house, within a property. They are invisible. And anyone that's working directly with gangs in London at the moment and elsewhere will tell you that children and drugs dealing is now invisible, whereas it used to be done on the street. It's not. It's done by way of a mobile phone, very cheaply to set up, and you achieve your drugs dealing within the environment of a house. That's very difficult to understand without the intelligence picture behind it.
Okay. And Fong, do you want to come in with the other question?
Yes. Lydia, she's asking about how we can make it less profitable. Because before you said that there are a lot of money. How can we try to decrease the money or have any impact on it?
Well, I suppose in terms of making it less profitable, I mean, it's a business, it's run as a business. They see themselves as entrepreneurs, they see themselves as business people. I think the more awareness we raise and the more understanding we have in terms of trafficking and modern slavery, for me, the more we are able to actually combat, the trafficking type of element. And actually, the more there's a point that was in terms of, do we go into schools, etc., and chat to the children and speak to the teachers. The more we are involved in those type of setups, the more children will become aware that actually there is an issue, and we hopefully will be able to combat it. But making it less profitable, gosh, it's quite difficult. It's a very, very challenging task. And I think as a preventative measure, absolutely we want to do these people out of business, but actually they always find a creative way around it. And I think it's about awareness, isn't it?
Yeah, I think one of the things we've found in our professional lives in the last 3 years dealing with, and I apologise if I keep going back to gang, because it's actually a very good descriptor in the UK where we are with our children being trafficked for criminal use. We've always got to make sure that every professional understands how to offer a child the opportunity to exit. And we don't do that very well. Policing has recently, probably in the last couple of years, started to pick up through work by those who really understand gang activity and serious youth violence, how frontline policing has a responsibility and can achieve that once in a lifetime, and I mean once in a lifetime, because these young children and young people's lives can be very short. There are very few options for leaving a gang. Policing has started to understand how frontline policing can offer that opportunity to exit. So even when children have been trafficked, we need to make sure our social workers, our police officers, our health professionals know that they have a once in a lifetime opportunity to say the right thing, do the right action to allow our children to exit. They're not there because they particularly want to be there, a lot of them, but they will. We have lots of evidence to show that they will exit if they're given the right, almost that once chance to say, can I chat? Can I talk? Can I do something? And we know the evidence is there that it works. Not always, but they will make that move when they feel it's safe to do so.
I think, sorry.
No, I was going to say, Marissa, I mean, what are the main forms of child trafficking in this country? I mean, is it domestic labor? Is it child prostitution? Is it even porn? Is it labor exploitation? What are children trafficked for mainly?
I think if you look at ECPAT and the website of them, there's lots of research recently that have been done in terms of Vietnamese children coming over. There's lots of information in terms of how children are being used to cultivate drugs and all those type of things like marijuana, etc. in this country. If you look more wider in terms of what the type of cases we and the police have to deal with, I think it's all sorts of forms in terms of exploitation. And it's from coercion, violence, transportation of drugs or running of drugs. It can be anything. It can be children going missing, finding themselves in a situation where they then are being exploited. I think it's much wider than that. It's vulnerability at the biggest scale.
Yeah.
And how do traffickers find the children? I mean, what's their process of doing that? Where do they get them from?
I don't know, to be quite honest. I mean, there's just so many drivers, so many reasons, so many opportunities. It's almost, I don't feel I'm informed enough to actually answer the question, if I'm really honest. I mean, I've just seen it for so many reasons.
I think we know they prey on, like I said earlier in my presentation, I think they identify really vulnerable groups. And they go to where there's poverty, where they know people have to, help their families, and then they offer them that opportunity. And I think that's the hook, isn't it, in terms of that? I'm not saying it's just poverty. If you look at children going missing from home or missing from care, and why they go missing, actually, it's the people they associate with and actually the people that they then become to trust, and that's where the exploitation happens.
And it might also be an unpalatable fact, but I know, Marissa knows, that the people we work with are very close to gang activity in this capital city. Children who are outside of the school and education environment, for whatever reason, are very, very vulnerable. Once they are removed from that day-to-day schooling, for whatever reason, I won't get into that, but once a child is exited from education, they are unbelievably vulnerable. And there's not something really that's accepted. And the whole system seems, in my personal view, to work against this issue. In that schools, yes, they have to keep some kind of sense, and children do have to be removed from schooling environments. But once they are out, they are utterly vulnerable to those that want to exploit them. And actually, I saw a picture some weeks back from someone who works within the gang environment, trying to get children to exit, of a child looking back longingly through the school gates because they know that was their stability. But when you turn away from those gates, there is a very big wide world outside for, say, a 13-year-old.
And that is when traffickers and all sorts of other people for criminal activity then access those children because they have nowhere else to turn.
No.
Or they feel that they have to turn to that person that's actually given a little bit of attention and actually become that trusted person to them.
Yeah. Eve Wilson asks if you could expand a bit more about how London can support police county forces better, and also what tools can be used to help trafficked children and their families.
Well, London and the other 42 forces across the country are trying to work much closer together. They have been for many years. It's just the range of issues they have to deal with. It's all about intelligence. It's all about tracking. It's about understanding the movement of commodity. And please don't take that the wrong way, but we are moving commodities across the UK by the use of children. It's actually an intelligence piece. It's no different than it's ever been about anything in my entire service. You've got to understand the intelligence piece, the movement piece. You've got to be able to talk better cross border. And there are some real challenges with that. Please do not think this is easy, but that's what police forces are trying to do.
But I also...
what about the tools and the approaches we can use with families to help with the trafficked children problem, Marissa?
I think, just touching slightly, but going on to your question about what Nigel has just said, the forces have worked very, very closely within the UK. I think professionals like social workers, education, etc., have not worked as closely. Since we've had the multi-agency safeguarding hubs, most people are now having the confidence and trust to share information. Now that in itself is a movement so much further ahead. I just think it's such a major issue, to be honest, and that we actually have to share that information cross-border.
I think there's a lot more to be done in terms of social media.
Absolutely.
I think as professionals, we don't understand the ways children, young people use social media to network. We might start to be able to talk about it, but actually how we use that to our advantage as professionals, there's not very much understanding across the UK.
So is that one of the major tools? I mean, social media is used a lot for extremism, for trafficking and so on, and we don't always understand that. Is that a tool we've got to get a better understanding of, Marissa?
Absolutely, and children and young people are telling us that actually professionals nowadays, as well as parents, but professionals mostly that are working with them, need to understand what's happening around them, need to move with the time, because that's the world that they live in, Generation Z, like they call themselves. So I think the millennials have moved so much quicker than we have, and the tool that we really do need to understand is social media in particular. There's all sorts of other tools that's being used for trafficking in particular. But again, for me, whatever tool we use, if the analysis of that issue or that problem or that risk or need have to be as wide as possible, because tools in itself, and if it only focuses, for example, on trafficking or modern slavery, can actually be a limitation in terms of what we actually need to do. And I'm not saying, tools are ineffective. What I'm saying is we need to use the tools appropriately. Because in my view, is we shouldn't polarize, like I call it, just one issue. We should look much more wider, much more further in terms of what's happening. And if you look at the connection with trafficking, modern slavery, missing, gang-related activity, serious youth violence, actually there's a connection and a link quite often between all of that, and tools can be good, but tools can hinder it as well. So yeah.
And Fong, do you want to bring up one of the other questions?
Yes, there is a question about do you have a success story?
There's many success stories. I mean, I myself have dealt with a young girl that was trafficked into the country. We were contacted by the UK Border Agency. They luckily picked up that the young girl was not a boy. The way that this little girl was dressed and her hair was cut and everything, she was presented as a boy, and she was actually brought into the country by a so-called uncle, which wasn't an uncle, and that was from Vietnam. And in the end, we took the case to court, and we actually safeguarded that child quite effectively. And I have seen this child many years later. We've moved her from the London area outside. And actually, she's really happy, she's thriving, she's doing really well. Educationally, she was obviously placed with a foster carer, who later became a long-term foster carer. So that success story for me was really, quite good. If it wasn't for the UK Border Agency actually asking questions and actually identifying appropriately that this young girl was actually at risk, I don't think anyone would have intervened at that point, because his story, this trafficker or alleged uncle, was so good, and all this little girl knew was his name, and her disclosures to us was so inconsistent as well. But I think that's quite a good story. There's many other stories out there in terms of how professionals, not just social workers, have worked with young people and actually do their best. Bernardos in particular have a trafficking service. They do really good work with trafficking and modern slavery.
And are there any examples, good case studies, for example, IJAS, where survivors help professionals and indeed help other victims themselves as a sort of peer group support?
There are groups. If you go on the ECPAT website, you'll find many type of links there. There's other national links in terms of websites, in terms of groups being brought together and doing what they need to do, and raising awareness. I think as it's not a new issue, but I think as we become more and more aware, especially locally, we tend to bring together children and young people, that have been through the process, so that they can actually inform us better and actually help us to deal and learn a bit more in order to deal with it. So there's many live case examples, but there's also other stuff in terms of the websites I've mentioned that you can go and have a look at.
Okay, I've got a question for Hannah. I'll bring that in last because it's quite an interesting one, but there'll be people on here who are just clearly very interested in what you're saying. And some may ask, well, what can I do? What can be done about it? What organizations can I go to? I just don't want to sit here. I mean, Parisha has done something. She started up a group. She started up a website. She's tried to create awareness, but maybe people can't do all of that, but they want to do something. What can they do, Marissa?
I think, to be honest, as people or as part of the community or society, we need to be a bit more aware. That's the first point that we need to do. We need to look out for certain things and actually see if there's any risk indicators. Now, that in itself might be difficult, but actually you can almost sense when something is not quite, right with the picture. What else we can do? There's many type of community type of projects within, local settings where people can join. As a parent in a school group, there's lots of other, education type of establishments that you can go to and be part of that. NSPCC, for example, as well as ECPAT, as well as Bernardos, anti-slavery. There's lots of websites out there that actually give really good advice, and where there's frequently asked questions where you can join in and actually participate and become more aware.
And Nigel, are there any sort of telltale signs that people are being trafficked that you can then report to the police?
That's really difficult. That's really difficult because everything is an individual point. I mean, the obvious ones are there children in your area that you don't know? I mean, it goes back to community and community, doesn't it? Do you understand the community you're in? We don't live in a society that's particularly in places driven by community cohesion, community-centric thinking. A lot of people live very individualistic lives, but some of the real telltales where children are trafficked to reside in another area is, what are they doing here? But that's very difficult to pick up. Okay, well, Hannah's question is really quite good to finish with, really. I mean, she's saying, are children safe to go to school on the bus? Do we need to worry about it? Or is social media dangerous? And it raises this whole question about, are we getting into a panicky society? Are we getting into a society where we're scared to let our children out because things are going to happen to them? Is there some reassurance we can have that we've got to give children the freedom, the protections there, but we've got to be wary as well, because we could go to the opposite extreme of becoming very paranoid and restrict our children, which will affect their growth and their development. No, I'll answer this. I couldn't agree more. I spent many, many years as a policing commander wrangling with this really difficult issue that the perception of crime is greater than the amount of crime that a person is likely to experience. And it's almost impossible as a professional to put the opposite point of view, because the whole of the media, if you go back to the media where people get their knowledge from, when was the last time you picked up a major newspaper that gave you a ton of great news stories on the front page? It doesn't. It gives you the real difficult stuff, the real hard-nosed stuff, the really upsetting stuff. And people have a perception in society, not just in this country, that things are far, far worse than they actually in reality are. Now, I say that because I passionately believe it. I watched for 31 years crime rise and crime plummet. And crime is lower in this country now, whatever you like to read on the front of certain tabloid newspapers, than it's been for many, many years. And that's the message that I tried, and policing commanders now are trying to get across. Because that feeds into the conversation. We do not need to have this fear of letting our children actually travel on the bus, on the tube, whatever. And it's great in London to see children travelling on the tube. It's wonderful. How do we combat the fear of parents? I've been a parent. I don't know.
I think you need to have balance there, and I think you need to use common sense. And that's from my personal experience. There's lots of different issues out there. It comes down to how you're parenting your children individually, what you're comfortable with, whether or not you think it's safe for them to travel or not. Clearly, young people and children themselves have a right, especially if they grow older. We need to actually encourage children to become responsible, have ownership, have that accountability for, what they need to do and where they need to go. So I really do think it's a personal matter in itself, but I don't think we should prevent children from traveling, if they are the age to travel by themselves, and they have to have a little bit of encouragement to be a bit more individual and actually not, cling to their parents the whole time, and actually grow up and be responsible citizens, then I think we have a duty to promote that type of self-independence as well.
I couldn't agree more. It's just amazing. I love getting on the buses and the tube and the train in London and watching children go to and from school on the public transport system quite happily, talking to the driver when they get on. I love it, and that's the kind of balanced position we need to maintain in this country.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That was a really, really interesting and detailed webinar, and we've had a lot of questions, and there are a lot more we could ask, but that was really interesting to everyone on the problem that people are concerned about. And I'm glad you ended on the last point, because I think that people think there is more crime than there is, and the statistics show that crime has gone down over the years. It may go up occasionally, but it's gone down over the years, and people are a lot safer than we think. But still, there is the problem of human trafficking and child trafficking, and we've got to address it somehow. So thank you for doing this webinar. As I said, we will have it recorded. It is being recorded. We will edit it and we will put it up as a YouTube video so everyone could see it. So thank you, Nigel and Marissa, for doing it. And thank you, everyone, for the questions and the comments you made. It's been really, really good. So I'm going to end this webinar now. So thank you, everyone, and good night.